So as I said, we have been talking through the last couple of weeks about Acts chapter 2. And before we dig in, I just want to read through our passage, refamiliarize ourselves with this and what is taking place, and then we're going to identify what our topic for this morning is going to be. So Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 42, it says this: "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common, selling their possessions and goods. They gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved." So this is our first glimpse into the church as an organized body as it existed in Jerusalem. We've been talking about this for the last couple of days. The first week we were in this, we talked about, why do you bother coming to church on a Sunday morning? What is your motivation for doing so? And we identified that we come out to church because we realize that there is something bigger and greater than ourselves at stake here. That the love of Jesus Christ covers a multitude of the world's sins, and that we have dedicated our lives to serving him. And we gather together corporately on a weekly basis on Sunday mornings to celebrate what God is doing in our lives. Last week we talked about what it means to cultivate healthy attributes for a church, what it means for a church to be sustainable and healthy. And we talked about how we have a job to do as a church to reach the lost, to reach the unsaved, to disciple people, to let them grow in their grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. This week we're going to talk about something a little bit different, something that might not always be so pleasant around church. You see, when we look at this passage in here, in Acts chapter 2, we can have a tendency to romanticize this first church. We have a tendency to look at this first church and what's contained in these first couple of verses and say, well, this is the perfect picture of what the church is supposed to do, what they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to act. And we can easily make this assumption that what they did in these first couple of verses continued indefinitely. But the reality is that we can look just a few chapters into Acts, as well as other books, and we can identify that the church pretty quickly started to get a little messy. Most theologians would say that this church existed successfully, however you define success, for about 3 to 5 years before things just kind of started to fall apart. Let me give you a couple of examples. The church was growing, but they weren't fully mature. The early church was largely a Jewish church that still incorporated Jewish practices to the exclusion of Gentiles. We can read about that in numerous places. This church originally gathered daily. We can read about that here in our passage, but very quickly in the book of Acts, we see that this church started to shift to a weekly gathering instead of a daily gathering. In Acts chapter 2, we see that this early church started off by selling all of their possessions, but eventually just started to set aside money as they were able to. Okay? We see that they sold all their possessions and they give to everyone as they had need. But within a couple of chapters, we see they kind of shifted their thought on that. Said, you know what, we're just going to set aside a little bit of money here and there. And we saw, you can see in Acts what happens to a couple of people, Ananias and Sapphira, when they're a little stingy with that stuff. We also see that really there's no formal missions or evangelism program that exists because they were almost totally dependent on the apostles. There's no organizational structure or program to address church discipline needs until much later in the New Testament. We also see that in Acts chapter 15, a council met in Jerusalem because they wanted to put limitations on the Gentiles that were beginning to come gather together and say that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised in order to get to join the fellowship. Now, the other week at our elder meeting, we discussed whether or not we need to do that at our church. Yeah, we're not going to do that. But we see that, even early on in the book of Acts, they were saying like certain people are not allowed into our fellowship unless they meet our criteria, unless they do what we tell them to do. What we see here is that this first church wasn't perfect. So if you are at all romanticizing this and saying this first church was perfect, this is the ideal, this is exactly how we should do what we should do, I want to dispel any thought of that because it wasn't perfect. They were trying to do what was right. They were doing their absolute best. They were doing the things that pursued the character of God, but they had flaws, just like any other church does. Just like our church has flaws. You see, for this early church, things very quickly began to get messy. And just like any church that you come to, whether it's our church or a church that you have come from, church gets messy at times. And the reason is because you and I are a part of it. And we bring our baggage, we bring our history, we bring our experiences, we bring our thoughts, opinions, and ideas in through the door. And because of all of this stuff, church can get a little messy. But hopefully, as we are striving together to deepen our walk with Jesus Christ and grow to be more like him and demonstrate his character and reflect his image, we can come to a place where we realize that the messiness of church is exactly what God desires. That the messiness of church is what propels you and I into a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ. And so the question we're going to tackle this morning is, what do we do when church starts to get a little bit messy? How do we respond? How do we react? How should we think? What should we say? What do we do when the church starts to get a little bit messy? Well, the first thing that we got to identify is we ask the question, who is church for? Who is church for? Is it just for believers? Is it for unbelievers? Is it for a mix of both? Who is church for? I want to give you a simple, I think, easy definition to tell you who I believe that church is for. I believe that church is for anyone who is earnestly seeking truth and direction in their lives. And they have a desire to do that within the context of relationships and community with other people. This means that church is for believers who have sought out and found truth in Jesus Christ. And they are looking for Jesus Christ to provide direction in their lives. And they desire to do that within community. This means that church is also for unbelievers who are searching for that truth, who are searching for that direction in their lives, and they know that the best place that they can find that is within the context of community with other people. Church is for people who are looking for truth, who are searching for direction, and desire to find those things within the context of relationships and community with other people. And so because church is for essentially anybody that desires to walk through these doors, they're inevitably going to bring their baggage with them, aren't they? We all walked in here this morning with our experiences. Good weeks, bad weeks, good experiences, bad experience. Good family stuff, bad family stuff. Personal issues, financial issues, whatever. We all walked in here this morning with junk, with messiness in our lives. But we walk in here because we desire to turn those things over to Jesus Christ and say, God, I want you to lead me. God, I want you to guide me and direct me in my life and show me what it means to yield all of these things over to you. So because of this, church can get a little bit messy. But before we talk about how we should respond to messiness in church, we got to talk about ugliness in church. Because oftentimes we can allow the messiness of church to get a little ugly, can't we? We can allow the messiness and the junk of church to get a little ugly. What do I mean by that? Most of us are not comfortable with messiness. Sure, I got it in my own life, and I'll deal with my own messiness, but I really don't want to deal with yours. I don't want to have to listen to your problems. I don't want to have to listen to the issues that you might be going through, the issues that you might be facing. But when we are faced with someone else's junk and their messiness, things can have a tendency to sometimes get a little ugly. Why is that? We love to gossip. We love to talk about people, but not necessarily to people. Church can get ugly because we might believe in the mission that a church has, but maybe I don't like the way that it's being carried out. And so I want to talk negatively about things that are taking place. Maybe I don't like all the leadership. Maybe I don't like all the people that are involved. Maybe I don't like Pastor Steve and some of the things that he says. And so as a result of this, we can take the messiness of church and we can make it personal. We can make it selfish. We can make it get a little ugly at times. That's not what God desires. God's desire is that as Christ followers, as a church that gathers together corporately, we would demonstrate the one another's of Scripture. That we would love one another and encourage one another, that we would support one another, that we would forgive one another, that we would hold one another accountable. But oftentimes we can easily have a tendency to set some of that stuff aside and say, you know what? I'd rather talk about this person than to them. I'd rather gossip about the church leadership and the decisions that they are making than actually going to them directly and getting some more information. I'd rather complain about someone else's attitude and treat them rudely and treat them poorly than actually get to know their story and who they are. When I see somebody walk into the church and maybe they got a bad attitude, they got a chip on their shoulder, I would rather treat them in a negative way than see what I can do to actually support and encourage their lives. So sometimes church can get a little bit messy. I want to encourage you to change your perspective on the messiness of church. And ask yourselves the question, how can I support people? How can I encourage people better? How can I hold other people accountable? How can I forgive and love other people? And remember that the grace of God was poured out on me first. So who am I to withhold that grace from somebody else? We don't want ugly churches. We don't want churches to get nasty. And let's just be honest. This church has had nastiness. This church has had ugliness. Here's the reality. Every church has. But it's up to us to make sure that we do what we can to get the ugliness out of this church and away from us and focus on what God is trying to do in our lives. So, churches get messy sometimes. Our church is messy. Our church is really messy. I'm grateful for that. Because the messiness of a church reminds us of what God is trying to do. There are 3 things that I want to share with you that are reasons as to why a church gets messy. If you have notes, feel free to take them. If you haven't grabbed a note page, they're out in the lobby. Feel free to just slip out because we've got some notes for you to take. But 3 reasons why church gets messy. The first reason is this. Churches are messy because it's the mission of the church to seek out and save the lost. The mission of the church is to seek out and to save the lost. Before Jesus ascended to heaven, after he died and rose again, he spent some time with his disciples, teaching them, forgiving them, loving on them, demonstrating his grace and mercy on them. But before he ascended to heaven, he left them with some words. In Matthew chapter 28, he says, "Go into the world and make disciples." Go into the world and make disciples. That's the Great Commission. That's the mission that all of us have as followers of Jesus Christ. But you see, the thing is he didn't give that mission or that great commission to the church as an organization. He gave that to you and I as individuals. And he said that as you go out into the world, wherever it takes you, to work, to your families, out in public, or even into the church, your responsibility is to go and make disciples. You are called to build my kingdom. You see, we all have the same mandate. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, we all have the same mandate to go into the world and make disciples. In Luke chapter 19, verse 10, Jesus is walking down the street, right? You've all heard this story. And he sees this dude up in the tree, this little guy named Zacchaeus. And he says, "Zacchaeus, come down out of that tree, right? We're going to go have a meal together. We're going to go to your house. We're going to have a meal. We're going to talk. We're going to invite some other people," right? And as the religious leaders and even the disciples saw Jesus do this with this guy, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Tax collectors didn't have a very good reputation. They didn't really like them very much. But as they see Jesus interacting with this tax collector and going into his house and breaking bread with him and having a meal and talking with him and all of his friends that weren't really liked either, the religious leaders and the disciples say, "Why are you doing this, Jesus? Don't you know who this person is? Don't you know the horrible things that they've done, the way that they take advantage of us? Why are you eating with this person here?" You know what Jesus' response was? He says, "I came to seek and save the lost." I came to seek and save the lost. Anybody that needs to know who I am, that's what I came for. And so that means that as we seek and save the lost, as we carry out that mission, we are going to get involved in messy situations. We are going to get involved in things that are not always so pleasant. I have a friend who's a dairy farmer back in Pennsylvania. And one of the ways that he says that he measures whether or not he had a successful day is based upon how much crap he scrapes off of his boots at the end of the day. If you've ever been to a dairy farm, you will know that they are filthy places. We don't have a lot of dairy farms out here. Mostly are, meat farms, right? But if you've ever been to a dairy farm, they are kind of gross places because when they bring the cows in to milk them, they're doing cowy things, right? And so he says, I measure the success of my day based on how much crap I scrape off of my boots, because everything that I scrape off is a reminder to me that I have a job to take care of my cows. Because if I don't take care of my cows, I can't put money in my pocket, I can't put food on the table, I can't put milk in your grocery stores for you to consume, and cheese and all those things. So that's how I know that I've had a successful day, because it's a reminder of what I am here to do. A lot of us need that reminder. A lot of us need that reminder as Christ followers that to follow Jesus Christ is not a clean thing. It gets messy. It gets a little gross at times. It gets a little bit crappy, right? But that needs to be a reminder to us as Christ followers that when we walk into this building, we walk into church, we are walking into the messiness of this life. And God has called us to step in it as much as possible so that we can demonstrate the love and character and compassion and grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. I want to remind you, church is messy sometimes. That as people bring their baggage in, as they bring their issues into the church, if you're really following Jesus Christ, if you're really pursuing his will for your life, you're going to step in it sometimes. But you shouldn't step in that and be like, oh man, this is unfortunate, right? The farmer at the dairy farm doesn't step in and go, oh, I can't believe that just happened. I am so surprised that I just stepped in that. No, because they know it's everywhere. It's unavoidable. But a lot of times I think we treat the messiness of church, the messiness of life, and we're surprised by it. We're surprised at the fact that we just stepped in somebody else's problems. We're surprised that I brought my own problems into church sometimes, right? Friend, don't be surprised by that. When you walk through these doors, you should expect that you're going to step into the messiness of other people's lives. Why? Because our mission as Christ followers is to seek out and save the lost. Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. Jesus stands up on a hillside with his disciples. He just gets done teaching them, and he looks out across the fields, and he sees the crowds. He sees the people that are gathered around to hear him talk. And we read in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, he says, when he saw the crowds, he was moved with compassion. He was moved with compassion. That word there in the Greek is splachismai. It means that he had a guttural reaction that made him cramp up and bend over because he was so moved. How do the crowds affect you? When you see the lost, the hurting, the dying of this world, when you see people walk into this church and you hear about their messiness, their problems, their issues, how do you respond? Do you look at the things that go on and say, oh man, I can't believe that's happening. What the heck, got to get out of here? Or are you moved with compassion? The same way that Jesus is. When he comes across the lives of people who are lost and dying and going to spend eternity separated from him, he's moved with compassion. What does that response look like in your life when you come across that? Churches are messy because it's our mission to seek out and save the lost. And that gets messy sometimes. If you walk into church and you expect that it's going to be a cookie-cutter Norman Rockwell painting, you are sadly mistaken, because it ain't like that. Show of hands. Who's got a perfect life here this morning? Didn't think so. Show of hands. Who's got a messy life here this morning? Yeah, we all do. We all got messy lives. And some of us are stepping in it a lot deeper than others. But you know what? You're in the right place to deal with it this morning. This is exactly the place that God wants you to come and deal with the messiness of your life. Why? Because you are hopefully surrounded by other people who have a desire to step in it with you, who want to be a part of your mess, who want to be a part of seeing you grow in your relationship with Jesus Christ and to see you develop and cultivate a relationship with Jesus Christ that works beyond the mess. It says that God, no matter what is going on in my life, no matter what kind of junk I'm stepping in, no matter what I'm dealing with, God, I can give it all over to you and let you take it. I can let you lead and guide and direct. Churches are messy because it's our mission to seek out and save the lost. And that brings messiness sometimes. That's the first reason. The second reason is this. Churches are messy because we all bring our lives to the table. When we walk into this place, you walk in, hopefully, with everything that you got going on. The joys, the sorrows, the frustrations, the celebrations, the doubts, the questions, the excitement. You walk into this place with everything that has happened, not only this past week, but this past month, this past year, maybe your entire lifetime. You walk into this place with your lives on the table. We've been going through the book of 1 Corinthians the last couple of months. And early on in the book of Corinthians, chapter 1, 26 through 28, Paul reminds the church of Corinth of something. He says to them, remember who you were when you were called. He says, remember who you were when you first came to Jesus Christ. Because the church at Corinth had forgotten who they were. They thought that they were elite. They thought that they were something special. They thought they were the bee's knees, right? And so because of who they thought they were above the messiness. Well, because of that pride that existed in their life, they were stepping in it even more than they realized. And Paul comes to them in chapter 1. He says, don't forget who you were. Don't forget who you were when God first came into your life, when he first called you out of sin and out of darkness. Don't forget who you were. Think about who you were when you first came to Jesus. Think about who you were and the things that you were doing that were part of your life. Maybe the sin that you were steeped in, the doubt, the fear, the frustration, the emotions that maybe existed in your life. For some of you, that might be something that you only have to look back just a few short months ago. For some of you, maybe it's decades ago. But think about who you were when you were called. You know, we need to remember as a church, as Christ followers, that we all bring our stories to the table when we walk in here this morning. Later on, we're gonna go to the Lord's table. We're gonna have communion together. And I said this last week, that communion, the Lord's table, is the great leveler in church. Because it reminds us that we are all on an equal playing field. That we have all experienced the grace and love and compassion of Jesus Christ. And so this is the place that we come as followers of Jesus and are reminded of the fact that we are all sinners. And that Jesus saved us all with his grace and love and mercy. But I think a lot of times we can have a tendency, like the church of Corinth, to walk in and forget about who we were. We can forget about the places we came out of. And so when that happens, we can have a tendency to look at the lives of other people and say things like, oh man, I can't believe that. Why would they act that way? Why would they say those things? Why would they make those choices? Like the church at Corinth, we can easily find ourselves pridefully looking at other people, forgetting about the grace of God, forgetting about the fact that God's grace is sufficient for all of us. You see, when you hear someone's story, we begin to see them a little bit differently, don't we? We don't often take the time to learn the stories of one another. And I think that storytelling, your personal story, is perhaps one of the most powerful tools that you have for building the kingdom of Jesus Christ. Because it reminds other people of who you were and where God called you out of and what he's calling you into. I want to encourage you, friends, to step into the stories of other people, to get to know the lives of other people and what they are going through, what they are facing. And if you ever come to a place where the messiness of someone else's life is causing you to start to become ugly towards them, I want to encourage you to go up to that person and say, hey, tell me your story. What have you been going through? What have you been facing? Tell me who you are. When we hear the story behind someone else's mess, we see them differently. We all need to learn how to become students rather than critics of other people's stories. We can all look back on a time in our lives where we knew that we needed Jesus, where there were things going on in our lives, whatever that might have been. And the grace of Jesus Christ came into our lives and radically transformed who we were. Now we bring that to the table. Now we bring our lives of transformation and change, of grace and love and compassion to this table, where it's the great leveler, where it's the equal playing field, where we can come together and say, you know what? You're a sinner just like I am. And I don't ever want to forget that. Sometimes, however, the messiness of life, being brought into a church, can have disastrous consequences, though. And I think some of us might be here this morning, we've experienced disastrous consequences in a church. Because perhaps you've been hurt by church. I know that some of you are here this morning because you left other churches that hurt you. Maybe some of you have bad experiences from churches. I know I personally do myself. I have bad experiences from church that caused me to leave the church and just walk away from God for long periods of time in my life. I know what it's like to have bad experiences in church. But even with those bad experiences, we are still called to gather together. But how do we handle that? If you are here this morning and you are recovering or you are working through a bad experience in church, there's 3 things that I want to share with you on how you can deal with that. The first one is this. I want you to acknowledge that you are hurt. Acknowledge that you were hurt by the church. Acknowledge that you were hurt by a decision that was made, something that someone said, something that the church maybe did. Acknowledge that you were hurt. I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that we were hurt. Oftentimes they say in recovery groups that the first step towards recovery is acknowledging the fact that you've got a problem. And I think many of us have experienced bad issues in church, bad experiences in church, and we've left one church and we've gone to another and perhaps even another and another still, but we never took the time to actually look back and say, you know what, I was actually hurt by that. I was hurt by what took place in church. I think the first step that we can take in recovering from a bad church experience is to acknowledge that you were hurt. The second thing that you can do is to take a look back. Take a look back at the reasons as to why you might have been hurt. Typically in situations where we've been hurt, we just want to move forward. We just want to forget. We don't want to have to take a look back. But I think it's important that we look back at what took place. Because when we don't properly assess the hurt that was caused and why, we run the risk of being hurt again, or of bringing our own hurt into a new place and causing hurt ourselves. You know, for me, I had a really bad church experience about 15 years ago where I was involved in the leadership. I was pastoring a church, and the person who started the church decided one day that rather than having a church, he wanted to have a music space where people can just come and read poetry, and they can dance, and they can do cool hipsterish type things. And it really left a bad taste in my mouth because I said, that's not why we're here. He said, but that's what's important, that we provide people with spaces that they can express themselves artistically. I said, no, church is because we want to bring people into the gospel message of Jesus Christ. And so because of this, we had a difference of opinion, and I left that church. And I went through a really dark time in my life, about 3 years of just running away from God, because I felt like God pulled the rug out from under me. I felt like God kind of did me over, and it wasn't fair, and I didn't enjoy it. And so because of this bad experience that I have a tendency sometimes, even today, to be triggered by certain things. Words that people might say, phrases they might use, things that they might want to do. And I can easily have a tendency to be triggered by some of these things and think about the bad church experience that I had. It's important for us to look back when we have bad church experiences and ask, what is it that actually took place? What happened? What can I do differently? How should I have responded to this? How should someone else have responded to this situation? When we've been hurt by church and we've had a bad experience, I think it's really important for us to look back and see what God was doing in our past. The third way that we can help to or begin to recover from bad church experiences is that we can't isolate ourselves. It's easy when you've been hurt by the church to say, I want to stay away from the church and everything that's involved with it. I know for me personally, that dark period of my life, Katie and I continued to go to church, but we sat in the back row for 3 years. We got there after church started. We left before it was over because I just wanted to be isolated. I didn't want anything to do with church people. I didn't want anything to do with other Christ followers because they had hurt me. But we can't isolate ourselves. If you've been hurt by a bad church experience, it's important that you don't isolate yourselves. God did not create us to live in solitude. And so when you abandon church, when you abandon other people, ultimately, you're the one that suffers. The last way that we can begin to recover from bad church experiences is to seek out restoration. To seek out restoration. Some of you might be here and you've had bad church experiences and you've been carrying the baggage of that experience for a long, long time. I want to encourage you to begin to seek out restoration. That might mean that maybe you've got to go to somebody from your past and ask for forgiveness or offer them forgiveness. Maybe that might mean that you've got to go to someone and talk through an issue in a way that you were hurt. Maybe because of the situation, that's not possible. But you still need to go through a process of restoring your walk with Jesus Christ. And so maybe that means that you have to go to Jesus and say, you know what, God, I got to turn this over to you because I'm tired of carrying this weight on my shoulders. I can't keep doing this. And so, God, begin to do a work in my life where you restore my relationship with you, where you restore my spirit. You know, if you are here this morning and you are recovering from a bad church experience, I want to tell you that you're in the right place to recover. That you're in the best place to be recovering and going through that process. Because I hope that as you interact with this community, with Strasburg Community Church, you can learn what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. You can learn what it means within this community and with these relationships, how to heal, how to grow, how to become more like Jesus Christ. Churches are messy because its mission is to seek out and save the lost. Churches are messy because we all bring our lives to the table. The last thing is this: churches are messy because you and I are a part of it. Churches are messy. They get messy because you and I are here. And what is the one thing that we all have in common? We're all sinners. And because of the sin that's in our lives, we make things messy. But you know what? Here's the beautiful thing about that. Romans 3:23 tells us that all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrated his love to us, and that while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. Just because you walk in here and you've got messiness in your life, just because you walk in here with baggage and bad experiences, just because you walk in here and maybe you've just had a bad week, that's okay. Because this is the place to deal with all that stuff. Church is messy because you and I are a part of it. Mess is ultimately what brings us together today. We gather in this place on a Sunday morning because whether we've already given our lives over to Jesus or we're just beginning to explore what that looks like for the first time, we acknowledge that our lives are messy and we're in desperate need of someone to rearrange them for us and clean things up. It's the mess that brought us together, but it's also the mess that brought God near. God saved us. He offered up his son, Jesus Christ, so that he could deal with the mess of your lives. John 3:16, for God so loved the messy people of this world that he gave his only son to die on a cross for our mess so that we can have eternal life with him. Churches are messy because you and I are here. And God welcomes that. God wants to save us out of that mess. God wants to put us back in a right relationship with him and remind us that he is the one who wants to deal with that mess on your behalf. And so maybe you're here this morning and you've been dealing with the mess on your own for far too long. I want to let you know that today can be a day for you to give that mess over to Jesus. Maybe you've been trying to give that mess over to Jesus, but you've been doing it in such a way that you've been isolating yourself from other people. I want to let you know that you are surrounded by a room full of people who desire to walk in your mess with you because they know that as they do that, they will see you grow in your relationship with Jesus Christ. Jesus died to take care of your mess. The church exists to deal with messy people like you and me. I think some of us need to put our mess back into perspective, though. And we need to remember that the reason we're here this morning is because we too have messy lives that need to be put back in order. Some of us are here this morning. We need to remember that you didn't always have your junk together. And perhaps some of us are here this morning because we need to be reminded of what humility and grace look like. Because perhaps you've become a little too big for your britches and forgot that you're a sinner as well, just like everybody else in this room. Some of us need to be reminded that in the midst of our messiness, that we've attempted to take that back over and take it from God because we don't want or need his help. But you do. You do need his help, and you need to give it back to him. So how do we lean into this? How do we lean into the messiness of church? 3 things to close with. The first way that we lean into the messiness of church is by being humbled by the grace of God in our own lives. We need to be humbled by the grace of God in our lives. This is the thing that Paul was constantly reminding the church at Corinth. They forgot about God's grace in their lives. Remember who you were when Jesus called you. Some of us need to remember the grace of God in our lives. If I'm understanding of the gift of God's grace in my own life, then who am I to withhold that gift from someone else's? There are people around you that need your grace. There are people that perhaps you are sitting right next to that need your grace and your compassion and your love and your understanding. Don't forget that you're here. Don't forget that you came to a saving faith and knowledge of Jesus Christ because of the grace that he poured out in your life. So give that grace to someone else. The second way that we can lean into the messiness of a church is by learning to love what God loves. When God placed Adam and Eve in the garden, he said that it was their job to reflect his image in everything that they did, to demonstrate his character of grace and love and mercy and compassion to everyone and everything that they experienced. We need to remember as Christ followers that as we deal with the messiness of other people's lives, we've got to love those same attributes. We've got to learn how to love that same character and reflect his image in the lives that we encounter. The third way that we lean into the messiness of church is by remembering that God is the main character of our story. We're selfish. We lack humility. We like to make ourselves the center of all things, don't we? But you know what? God should be the center of everything in your life. God should be the main character of your story. Because this life isn't about you. This world is not about you. Your job is not about you. Your family is not about you. Coming to church is not about you. It is all about him. And we need to remember that as we travel through life and hopefully grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, that he has got to become the main character of my story and everything that I do. Because I think when we remember that Jesus is the main story, it helps to put things into perspective when we deal with someone else's messiness. When we deal with someone else's life and their problems and their issues, as we try and refocus them back to Jesus Christ. You see, in the messiness of life is where we find beautiful displays of forgiveness, compassion, reconciliation, and love. And I want to encourage you this morning that as you deal with the messiness of life, as you deal with the messiness of church, that you remember it's all about Jesus. It's all about his grace being poured out in your life.